It's February 14th, 2020, and this is episode 17 of Film Cult Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chris, and this week, as in every week, we are reviewing 3 different movies. So, last week's episode, we did a bit of a themed episode of war movies. Each film that I reviewed, I basically picked a movie for each war, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam, and I reviewed each movie on that. I had a lot of fun doing that, so I'm going to continue doing some themed episodes here to kind of give each episode its own category, explore it a little bit, and move on. Sometimes I don't do that, sometimes I do, but this one also, just from the 3 movies that I ended up picking, kind of sort of have a similar tone to all of them, and it's definitely been a bizarre week. These 3 titles, if you do watch any of them, or if you end up watching them because of this, these are not your average everyday movie picks, and I did that on purpose. It's more or less the theme is kind of like mindfuck movies, I guess. These movies, all of them have really outlandish plot lines and weird psychedelic journeys almost, and so I'm gonna call this the mindfuck episode because all of these stories are just bizarre, out there. And so the 3 movies that I am reviewing today, enough talking about what they're like, talk about the actual titles. I'm going to start off with the 1999 American epic drama film Magnolia, and then I'm going to transition to a 2006 film, which was a science fiction thriller film directed by Richard Linklater, which is called A Scanner Darkly. And then I'm going to finish off with a cult favorite with the psychedelic satirical black comedy Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, of course with Johnny Depp. Those are the 3 movies today. They are all 3 weird choices, but we're going to talk about each one of them. I'm going to recommend them or not based on how I felt about watching it after. And that's basically the format of this episode. So, without further nonsense, I guess we will get right into our first review, which is, like I mentioned before, the 1999 American epic drama film, written, co-produced, and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. This film stars Jeremy Blackman, Tom Cruise, Philip Seymour Hoffman, William H. Macy, Julianne Moore, John C. Reilly, just to name a few. It's basically a very segmented plot telling storylines of all these separate different people, and it's a mosaic. This is reading from the Wikipedia. A mosaic of interrelated characters in search of happiness, forgiveness, and the meaning of life in San Fernando Valley. So, if that sounds very ambiguous and vague, it is intentional because it is. I like the initial setup of this movie. We really start off with a history lesson, basically, on very coincidental events in history. Just everyday things that happened that have, after further research, have very, very big coincidences in them. It's kind of hard to explain, but I believe they tell one story about a person who I think gets murdered, and they get murdered on a street called Greenberry Hill or something, to that effect, and the 3 perpetrators were named Green, Berry, and Hill. Just things of that nature. There's another story told. These are back in the early 18 or 1900s of a boy who goes to commit suicide, jumps out a window, and is shot by a shotgun before he is on his way down, fully lands. And it is actually his mother who shot the weapon at her husband, and missed, shot through the window and collided with him just as he was falling past that floor of this building. So again, a very large coincidence that almost seems like too much connected to even be true, but it is. So that's kind of like a really interesting setup, and it kind of leads our way into this modern day story of Magnolia. Um, I gotta say, from that beginning, I was intrigued. This film has a lot going on. These stories are all fleshed out. William H. Macy is one of them. Um, a relationship between John C. Riley as a Fernando police officer and one of the places that he's going to on duty is another plot line. We have Tom Cruise's plot line or going on his story with he is like a motivational speaker, very meninist kind of guy. Talks about like objectifying women and using them as property basically. And so there's that kind of plot line going on, and there's a whole game show plot line going on with a bunch of kid actors and um, Julianne Moore's plotline going on. It's a lot to absorb, and through the first hour and a half of the film, you're basically finding out all of these different stories, and you're kind of diving into each one of them. Apologize for the cars going by my house; it's incessant. Um, but yeah, we're basically going into each one of those stories. We're learning a bit. We're jumping around to other ones, and they don't seem connected at all. And that's on purpose because they aren't yet. And of course, towards the end, the second and third act of the film, we start getting some connections through the exposition, through the narrative. We are making connections to other stories that we are seeing, and some of them we aren't. But it more and more you go into the film, it paints a clearer and clearer picture. But towards the end, um, especially when spoiler alerts here, if you are planning on watching the film, do not listen further. But yeah, especially when um, frogs start falling from the sky, and almost a biblical turn of events. That wasn't something I was expecting. But yeah, the third act, when all these frogs are raining from the sky and hitting people and bashing windows of cars and such things, it just seemed like definitely a very different turn from where I thought it was going. Not that that's a problem at all. It's good to keep you guessing in that kind of sense. But yeah, this like divine intervention, or almost like these, like I said, from the Bible, this tale of frogs as like one of the plagues that was sent. I'm not really a religious person, but that's the extent of my knowledge. So, like I was saying, you hear all these stories and you're waiting for them to connect, and you're waiting for them all to like sync up, or at least I was, to like the stars to kind of align and kind of have that straight line coincidence that like is referenced in the beginning of the movie with all those historical tales that they go through in story. But for me, I felt like the ending of this right shy of 3 hour film is a little lackluster. I did kind of get confused in the middle of it, kind of bored through the second act to the third. The stories do feel real and stuff of that nature. The acting is good. Philip Seymour Hoffman, John C. Riley. I feel like both actors that you've seen a lot of different things. And of course, rest in peace to Philip Seymour Hoffman. But John C. Riley's had a pretty amazing career considering all of his drama work and comedic efforts as well. You know, Talladega Nights and Step Brothers and those other Farrell comedies. So yeah, that is basically my summation of Magnolia. I I feel like I do have to watch it again to fully understand what I did watch, but at this current time, I wouldn't recommend it. It was tad too over long for me, and tad too drawn out. It's 3 hour runtime. If that doesn't bother you, maybe give it a shot. But I didn't feel like the story paid off for how much I was investing into it for all that time. So yeah, my first review of Magnolia. Do not recommend it at this time. It is just as far as the scheme of these other two films, it's not the weirdest thing I've watched, but we are getting there. So, my second film, we're shifting a few years ahead to 2006, and we're going to talk about a adult animated sci-fi thriller film based on a 1977 Philip K. Dick story, and that is A Scanner Darkly. The standout thing about this movie, if you've heard of it at all, I haven't heard anybody ever talk about this film. I just found it somewhere in my movie findings research kind of deal, but for all the stars that are in this film, Robert Downey Jr., Woody Harrelson, Winona Ryder, and of course Keanu Reeves, all these pretty high profile actors, I don't hear this title at all. And I feel like I talk about movies quite frequently with people I know, but yeah, it's just one of those underrated or under the radar rather, I don't know if it's underrated, but films that kind of has a cult following. Not that matters to this film cult title, totally different kind of meaning there, but I am going way far off my track. But yes, Philip K. Dick wrote this story by the same exact name. He is a very popular science fiction writer, mostly pertaining of short stories and novels. He wrote this story, and like I was saying, the standout feature of this, I didn't go into, is that this film is animated in a very strange technique of rotoscoping, which they use the original frame-by-frame live-action footage, and then they animate on top of it, and it gives it a very traced, illustrative kind of feel to it with this interlacing rotoscope technique that they use to film it. So yeah, if anyone's talking about anything for this film, it's probably that 18-month animation process that they use to make the whole entire film animated. So yeah, the characters look almost drawn. The colors always like waving around. I think it works good for the story that is being told. There's, like I said, this is a science fiction film, so there's some elements with the world that work better with this animation technique, I guess, and the story that they're trying to portray. But it's very, very strange. Basically, Keanu Reeves is a detective, and he wears something called a scatter suit, which basically shields his identity from the rest of the world. You're basically always morphing as a thousand and a half or something, 1.5 million different people or something they explain in the film, but you're constantly changing between men, women, and children, and your body's always morphing around, so you can never know what the true identity under the suit is. And basically he is trying to track down a new star drug called Substance D, and so he is basically looking into his this drug addiction epidemic, and I don't know if I mentioned, but Robert Downey Jr. is also in this film. There's just a lot of big names for this kind of weird, obscure movie that, for me, gets very convoluted, and you could see the overall morals and teachings of the story, what you're trying to get out of it. A lot of things about all three of these movies is that they deal with substance abuse and drug abuse, and how addiction works, and kind of this film definitely highlighting how surveillance works and how our privacy is taken away from us as well. So there's these really good themes for it in the story, and for me, just the plot gets really, really confusing, and Keanu Reeves is investigating basically himself, but they don't know that the identity is not him. So he's at some points watching himself on camera. Sometimes he is with his friends, like RDJ, and Woody Harrelson is kind of playing this like surfer dude kind of Reminds me of Drake Bell's character from The Amanda Show. Like, that's how he looks like. That one skit. Anyway, way off. But yeah, Richard Linklater directed this film. You may or may not know him from his different projects. He is mostly known for his realistic and natural humanist films. Dazed and Confused, his School of Rock. So this really doesn't fit with like other type of pictures that he has made. Boyhood is another one of his works. Yeah, again, I can't recommend this film because I don't feel like I fully understood it. I watched the whole entire analysis on the movie after viewing it to try to get a deeper understanding, and that video, which is just someone on YouTube trying to explain the plot and the meaning, that person definitely enjoyed the movie more than I did, and I definitely appreciate the motives and themes in this story and where it ends up going. But yeah, just for me, it was just a little too much. The animation is very cool. It reminds me of something. A more contemporary example is the Amazon Prime series that came out, I believe, in the summer, called Undone. I don't know if it's a similar technique or the same technique. They probably use rotoscoping for that as well. It seems like a little more refined of a process for Undone. I feel like it looks a lot better, and they use it a little more to its advantage, with these kind of the world under the influence of drugs. You can kind of see all these different hallucinogenic things in this movie, and then in Undone, there's a lot of supernatural elements that they can animate really well with this process. So yeah, now I'm just kind of rambling, but the animation is probably more the highlight than the actual story for this, for me, and that's why I can't fully recommend it. But like I said, really big names in this movie: Robert Downey Jr., Woody Harrelson, Winona Ryder, Keanu Reeves, some big stars in it. So if one of those are one of your favorites, I always enjoy Woody Harrelson, and I feel like he does a pretty good job in this film. It's just very obscure, very weird movie. Wouldn't recommend it if you're just looking for a quick popcorn flick at all or anything like that. But if you're willing to try something a little different, I'd probably give this a half recommendation. Just because I do think the animation's neat, and I do think the story told morally is good. So yeah, that is my second review of today of A Scanner Darkly. And so we are moving to our third and final review. Quickly would like to mention that I did make the poster for this one. Last week I made all three of the posters for the films I reviewed. This week I did not make it for A Scanner Darkly or Magnolia, but for this one, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, I made it. So if you guys wanted to take a look at that, please head on over to Chris Mitchell Artwork, my art Instagram, or head on to the video version of this podcast if you're not there already on YouTube, to check it out. But yeah, that's my little plug of myself before I start my third and final review of the day, which I just mentioned is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which came out in 1998. It is an American psychedelic satirical black comedy road film adapted from the Hunter S. Thompson film of the same name, novel of the same name. It is directed by Taron Gilliam, and it stars Johnny Depp and Benicio del Toro as Raoul Duke and Dr. Gonzo, respectively. So basically, this film goes over their road trip, like I said, road trip journey through Las Vegas and their journalistic intentions, and they explore the whole city, and they are constantly under the influence of psychedelic and psychoactive drugs and substances, and basically, yeah, this is a 2-hour film of drug abuse and psychotic breaks almost. Um, Johnny Depp is just rambling in obviously a drug state, and Benicio del Toro is just freaking out from excessive use of drugs. And this whole film has a very wacky and contextual feel to it. Of course, you're supposed to feel kind of how they are feeling too. A lot of close-up shots, a lot of um, interesting use of like CGI and practical effects too, to give like um, Johnny Depp sees bats in the sky that aren't there, obviously, and they're constantly attacking him. And we can see the bats in the reflection of his glasses, but they're not actually there. Um, like I said, this is adapted from the Hunter S. Thompson novel. He is an American journalist and author, very popular for his gonzo style of journalism, which means to write in the first person, give a first-hand account of experiences and the stories that they are writing. They put themselves literally in the story. Of course, very usual form of journalism now, but he kind of propelled that sort of style of writing. Whereas before it'd be more of a setback from the journalist point of view style of writing stories, I guess, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so he's a very, very eccentric and strange person. Also has a very tiny cameo in this film at one point where he's playing poker, and Johnny Depp, who's playing him, obviously, says, "Oh, that's me," and it's actually Hunter S. Thompson. So that's just a little fun fact if you are ever watching this. Yeah, this film is very strange, but I gotta say, out of all three films that I've reviewed today, this one is probably the one I had the most fun with. I was kind of scratching my head with the other two, and this one kind of, you have like just silly, nonsensical kind of laughs with it, and you just kind of laughing at how bizarre everything is. And I can kind of move away from the fact that I didn't get the story for this one either, and kind of just focus on the visuals and the laughs, and I had a good time with it. It's very strange. Like I said, all three of these films are just so weird. They are not things that you would see on TV every day, going through movie channels. They have their own quirks and feelings to them, but they're just really oddball films. And so, if any of these even sound remotely interesting, I would give them a view. And I think for the cult aspect of this, I would recommend Fear and Loathing if you want to just catch a part of it. I don't feel like the whole film, it seemed to drag a little bit at the end for me. I was like, oh, please be like only like 10 minutes left, and there was 20 minutes left, so that wasn't too bad. Usually when I'm getting antsy for the film and I look and there's still an hour left or something, and I'm like, oh my god, this is really dragging. But this film was almost over when I got to that point, so not a bad movie. Definitely does a good job of showing the psychedelic trips that are going on in their heads. And there's a part where the whole room breaks into like a reptilian orgy, I guess, and all these once human characters are now dinosaurs and reptiles, and they're all biting each other's heads off and stuff. And it's very, very, very strange. And of course, with Johnny Depp, it almost has like a Tim Burton feel in that moment. But yeah, this film's pretty fun. A lot of good laughs. A lot of just weird moments in it. But yeah, I am very excited to move on to more, not mainstream films, but more linear stories and not such mindfuck movies as we just went over. So that is basically the end of my 3 reviews for this week, episode 17 of Film Cult Podcast. As always, you can send me movie suggestions, critiques on the show, whatever it may be, at filmcultpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's filmcultpodcast@gmail.com. I'm going to try to. I've noticed that I've been just jumping between like the 80s and 90s to current modern 2020 day films, all the years in between. I'm going to try to hit some more 50s and 60s and 70s genre films. I kind of want to be all over the place as far as filmographies are concerned, just to keep the show fresh and new and to have some different titles each time. Yeah, I'm just trying to explore movies overall, and it's just such a very gigantic monster to take on, I guess. But I digress. So, like I said, um, maybe more going into 50s films and stuff like that, black and white pictures, and um, stuff that I have previously explored, but not to its fullest extent. So, yeah, that was the selection of today's 3 movies, all weird, mindfuck, obscure thriller films, I guess, that explore genre of drug abuse and, I guess, the human psyche. So, yes, that was today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. As always, we are on YouTube and Spotify. So we are now 4 or 5 weeks streaming on Spotify as well. So that is really cool. If you're on one, check out the other. If you're on the other, check out the other one. YouTube or Spotify, just to find your preferred format. But yeah, I'm just rambling on to try to fill up my 30 minutes of time, but I do not think I'm going to get there now. But 27 minutes isn't that bad. So yes, thank you so much for listening to Film Cult Podcast again. If you have come back for more, or if this is your first time, thank you for joining me. I will see you all next week for episode 18 of the show. I hope you have a fantastic Valentine's Day, which is today, and a fantastic weekend. See you guys next week.